My name is Maxine Doogan, and I am the founder of the Erotic Service Providers Legal Education and Research Project. I'm going to read my remarks to you today. An erotic service provider is anyone who earns a living from their erotic labor: prostitutes, exotic dancers, adult film performers, phone sex operators, and webcam performers, which are the fastest growing part of the sex industry. And I myself work as a prostitute of 22 years, and I plan on working as a prostitute for another 22 more. Our group opposed Prop 35 because it relies on the continued criminalization of our labor under the guise of rescuing trafficked victims. It turns all of our intimate, domestic, and economic relationships into traffickers and sex offenders, and we find this completely offensive and inappropriate. In my report to you today, I'm going to correct the legislative analyst's initial report to bring to light how passing Prop 35 will significantly increase costs to the city and counties of California by proliferating the prison industrial complex. This negative impact on public safety will not stop human trafficking, at least in my industry. And I'm going to make some specific recommendations about how you, as legislators, might address human trafficking in my industry and remedy the problems in Prop 35 if it's passed. The Legislative Analyst's Office initial report stated that it didn't know whether Proposition 35 will increase state human trafficking arrests and convictions because the Legislative Analyst's Office doesn't understand how the enforcement for human trafficking is carried out. The enforcement for human trafficking laws are carried out by local and federal law enforcement agencies who conduct prostitution sting operations under the guise of rescuing children and stopping human trafficking. News outlets all over California have repeated reports generated by local and federal law enforcement agencies after prostitution sting operations, which result in both adults as well as underage alike at a ratio of 9-to-1 being arrested for prostitution. So that's 9 adults for every underage person that's being arrested for prostitution. Popular TV shows on human trafficking show prostitution sting operations where everyone is arrested for prostitution under the guise of rescuing children. Everybody goes to jail, everybody becomes a defendant, and has a criminal case that's being adjudicated in criminal court. Under Proposition 35, we shall expect to see an increased expenditure for city and counties in the form of prostitution sting operations because of the financial and political incentives for law enforcement to do so based on both the expanded definition of human trafficking in combination with the already existing vague definitions of prostitution-related offenses. I have provided you with declarations from an anonymous adult white female sex worker who had been entrapped in one such prostitution sting operation by a naked FBI agent who posed as a customer under the guise of rescuing children. While in another instance of a prostitution sting operation, she performed on a local law enforcement officer oral sex before she was arrested. I also provide for you in your packet a redacted police report of a 29-year-old black female who too was arrested for prostitution under the guise of rescuing children. Their identities have remained hidden because, like the women who have spoken here today, nobody involved in prostitution has access to equal protection under the law. Proposition 35 doesn't provide any ability for prostitutes to come forward and make reports when we're victims of crime without the threat of being investigated or arrested for prostitution. We know that when one member of our society cannot come forward and report violence, all members of our society are at risk to suffer the same violence. These accounts that you have before you show how law enforcement officers are allowed to have sexual contact with people they are arresting for prostitution, as this type of entrapment is legal in California. If they are treating adults like this, we know they're treating minors in the same disrespectful and dangerous manner. Proposition 35 offers no accountability and no oversight, so we expect this type of corruption will proliferate. Additionally, Prop 35 will greatly affect public safety as law enforcement officers as well as prosecutors will now have economic and political incentives to continue the misrepresenting of the facts to the public in criminal cases. So you, as legislators, will need to do 1. address the need for new sanctions to deter prosecutors' misconduct, and 2, remove sexual contact as a legal means to entrap prostitutes in criminal cases under the guise of rescuing human trafficked victims, and 3, institute specific reporting requirements for all local and state law enforcement agencies that perform prostitution and human trafficking arrests to assess the cost to all city and counties, as there is a great need for transparency and accountability that Prop 35 does not provide. If we cannot track it, we cannot address it. In regards to the cost incurred each year due to the new mandatory training requirements for certain law enforcement officers under Prop 35, we cite flaws in the J.C. Doogan case where law enforcement officers missed so many opportunities to rescue her. Therefore, mandating training under Prop 35 will increase because enforcement officers seem to have so much trouble identifying victims of any kind. This flaw, in combination with law enforcement being allowed to have sexual contact as a legal means to entrap to make prostitution arrests under the guise of rescuing victims, means that there will be continued misdirected priorities. In regards to the increased costs to state and local governments for incarcerating and supervising human traffic offenders under Prop 35, we expect further overcrowding of California's prison population that will drive California into bankruptcy, resulting in detrimental effects on the public safety because of the expanded definitions that are vague in combination with the financial and political incentives for law enforcement to make prostitution-related arrests under the guise of rescuing human trafficked victims. And finally, the unknown amount of additional revenues for new criminal fees to fund services for human trafficked victims is too wishful thinking under Prop 35. We point to San Francisco's first offender prostitution diversion program as the example, where the taxpayers are picking up the tab for the salaries of the nonprofit workers who provide sex-negative, shame-based counseling to those of us who are arrested for prostitution under the guise of providing us, quote, services, unquote. Therefore, we recommend, 1, complete decriminalization of prostitution, as to remove the incentives from law enforcement and anti-trafficking nonprofits to profit off the criminalization of our labor. Those who want to receive, quote, services should be available to do so without suffering being put out of work via a prostitution arrest. And 2, legislators might regulate these peer counselor type services provided by these anti-trafficking nonprofits to mandate higher quality counseling requirements similar to those required of state social workers when providing services. And in conclusion, my suggestion is that that you cut the funding for the arrest of prostitutes and all prostitution-related offenses as a state, that you decriminalize prostitution, and you specifically enact equal protection laws for all types of erotic service providers that ought to include anti-discrimination legislation in housing, employment, education, child custody, and anti-predator financial institution practices. Without the fear of arrest, of being discriminated against, in combination with equal access to protection, this will bring the necessary transparency that will be a new public treasure, and everybody will benefit from that, and especially people who are involved in forced labor and human trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments?
Yes. Thank you very much, all of you. This is a complex issue.